Hello there. Today we're going to talk about something every project requires unless it's something that finishes like the top of a hat where you just gather stitches, and that's binding off. Binding off is the same as casting off. They're just different knitting traditions around the world that use different words, but they mean exactly the same thing. So I have here a swatch of 20 stitches and 20-ish rows, worsted weight on a size 9 needle. And I have done this in a light colored yarn so that I can see and you can see what it is that I'm doing. All of my swatches were knit on the same yarn and the same needles, but it really only takes a little tiny bit. And if you want to try these different bind-offs for yourself, I suggest swatching because, boy, nothing makes it more clear than that. So when you bind off, what you want to do is you want to knit the first 2 stitches. And this is where beginners get all kinds of confused. I have knit the first 2 stitches. They have been fully transferred to my right hand needle. And what I'm going to do, let me zoom in so you can see, I'm going to use the tip of my left hand needle to pick up the first stitch that I made, pass it over the second one and off the needle. Let me do that again. So the next stitch you would knit 1 and then use the left tip to pick this stitch up, pass it over and off. One of the common things that I hear from people is that their bind off is too loose or too tight. We're going to talk about tight first. And this right here is your problem. You're a yarn puller. When you knit the stitch, you pull. And then you pass this stitch over, and most of the time you give it a little extra tug. Nobody wants their knitting to fall apart, right? So you just tug. And if you've ever had an Afghan that the bottom edge is much more wide than the top edge, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Watch me go. So as I'm knitting, I am binding off tightly. That's what happens when you tug your yarn. You tighten it up. There are occasions where bind off tightly is noted, but I have to say it's pretty infrequent, usually like shoulders or something, and you'll see exactly why in 2 stitches. So as I work across, I'm just binding off. When I get to the last loop, you have 2 options. You can make this loop a little bit larger and just pass the tail through it, which is usually what I do. I've got it attached to a little tiny ball of yarn here, so this will be trickier. But just feed it through, pull it up. The other option is to cut it and pull it free, which also works. But let's take a look at my tight bind off. You can see it's got nice regular tension. But here's where the problem comes in. Here's my cast on. Here's my bind off. The 2 don't pull to the same size. Like I can pull this cast on only to here. Or the cast off. The cast on, which I used long tail, pulls a good 1.5 inches more than the bind off. That's not good if you have an Afghan. And it always looks a little gathered along here. You might also know that it curls in. Let's talk about the curl first. The curl is because this is stockinette. I was on the knit side and I bound off as if to knit. What makes stockinette curl, and there's really not much you can do to stop it, it's a strong force in our knitting, is that all of the knit stitches tend to just kind of curl this way. And when you line them all up like this, they're going to go like a hot dog on the edge. It's just the case. You can put edgings around it. There are other things you can do to help mitigate the curl, but if you just take straight stockinette and you bind it off straight across, it's going to curl. Fact. All right, this bind off is what I would call too tight. Let me show you with a different swatch. here I have the same 20 stitches and the same yarn, exactly the same. This time I'm going to bind off loosely. Let me pull this up so you can watch what I'm doing. The first thing I'm doing is not tugging after every stitch. I want to maintain the elasticity of the yarn, so I'm going to go around this a little more loosely than I normally would. No extra tug, pass that stitch over. It really is an art to learning the correct tension to cast off, and every situation is a little bit different. But I am not pulling this yarn taut across my finger or across my needles. Here's the fairy's #1 safety tip. If the tip of your finger turns blue, you are wrapping your yarn too tightly. Stop it. As you get to the end of the bind off, another common problem is that the last stitch looks really dog-eared. And I'll tell you why. Because as you knit, trying to bind off loosely, you stretch the stitch that was on the left-hand needle. I don't know, somehow it feels like that should help, I guess. But what happens instead is that you tighten up the stitches that came before, and when you get to the end, you have this. It's the way it is, and the way to avoid it is to not pull your needles so far apart as you knit, and also don't drag extra yarn with you as you work. I'll demonstrate on another one, but to fix this business, pulling on this won't do you any good. This is not the problem. It is the row before. What you need to do is take your needle and kind of take that extra yarn that you grabbed and pulled with you the whole way and just ooch it back into the knitting a little bit, not a long way, but I'm just picking up each leg of the stitch below the cast off and pulling some of that extra yarn into the fabric. That helps a little bit. But now, here is my loose bind off. Let me zoom back out. Here is my tight bind off. I want you to compare the same 20 stitches. So the left edges are right here together. First off, without any stretching whatsoever, my loose edge is 5 stitches or 1 whole inch wider than the tight bind off. Also, this is what happens. This is the max that my loose bind off can stretch to, and my tight bind off goes to there. It's quite a difference. Quite a difference. If you were doing this at the top of a sock or around the neck of a sweater, it could mean the difference between wearable or not. And you can see that my cast off and my cast on edges on the loose swatch stretch to approximately the same size. It doesn't do anything to alleviate the rolling. That's another video. But it does help you at least get them to be the same size.